Series on the Roman Empire. Just like the previous videos, I'm going to divide these into several parts just to make them more reasonable so that you don't have to watch them all in one sitting. So let's get started with geography. There are many similarities between the geography of ancient Rome and the geography of Greece. Just like Greece, we're looking at a peninsula that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea. One of the major differences, though, is that the geography in Italy does not hinder the political unification of the Roman Empire in the same way that it did in Greece. Part of this is because the mountain ranges in Italy were not as rugged as the mountain ranges in Greece. So it did not prevent trade and travel as much. It did hinder political unification in the earlier days of Rome, but not so much in the later. As far as the location of Rome itself, it was along the Tiber River, which provided obviously a good source for fertile soil. The area surrounding Rome at first was swamp-like, but over time, their knowledge of technology allowed them to drain these swamps, which created more farmland. And so in general, the area that surrounded Rome had a very mild climate, a moist climate, which lends itself to very fertile soil. So it was very agriculturally based. So the founding of Rome is based on an ancient myth of two twin brothers named Romulus and Remus. According to the myth, these twins were cast into the wilderness and left for dead, but they survived and they were raised by wolves. So they had this sort of animalistic character to them. They eventually returned to try to found a great city, a city that would become Rome. But as we know, since they were raised by wolves, they had a very ferocious spirit. And so the two brothers had a disagreement about the location of the city and also who should be the king. So they left the decision to the ancient priests of early Rome. They were called augurs. And the augurs chose Romulus to be the king of the new city. Now, Remus refused this decision by the priests, and so the brothers fought, and Romulus killed Remus, and then Romulus decided to name the city Rome after himself, and Rome was officially founded in 753 BC. So what's interesting, I think, about the legend of Romulus and Remus, even if it's just a myth, is that the city of Rome itself was founded under violence. And that's very fitting if we think about the violence and bloodshed that sort of characterizes the Roman Empire, both in its expansion and also in its decline when it is invaded by barbarians. So the earliest Roman people were a combination of people from different areas. There were the Etruscans. They came from northern Italy. And then there were the Latins, which came basically from where Rome is. And they were called Latins because of the language that they spoke. And then the Greeks, who we obviously already talked about, so I'm not going to get into detail about the Greeks so much. So the Etruscans, they actually have genetic links to people from Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, so they came from farther east. They had a sufficient knowledge of the bronze industry, so they already were mining iron, copper, and tin, and they were making weapons out of metal, and they were also making tools. So in general, they had strong technological skills. And there was a theory that the Etruscans were responsible for things like the roads and temples of the early Roman period, as well as the military tactics that they displayed in battle. So in general, the Etruscan people were credited with this strong technological knowledge. They established some of the earliest cities in what will become the Roman Empire, so between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. And they also used the alphabet that came from the Greek colonists of southern Italy because they traded with them and it was easier for them to have a common language. And the Etruscans ruled themselves through monarchy. So they had kings of different areas in their ancient lands. So they definitely correlated around a monarchy. And then there were the Latins. which they were the ones who actually founded Rome. Romulus and Remus themselves were people of Latin descent. The Etruscans tended to look down upon them. They did not see them as knowledgeable. They saw them as backward. We know again that the Etruscans had that really strong technological knowledge which the Latins lacked. But the Latins have a really important legacy of the founding of Rome because first off, they brought the language to Rome. Their language was eventually adopted and spoken by all Roman peoples. And as we'll continue to discuss, the Latin-based languages are going to move on eventually to form the Romance languages that were spoken throughout Europe. So what's going to happen is that eventually the Latin people are going to start to mingle and marry with the Etruscan people. And eventually they're going to start to resent the Etruscan kings because they were treated as inferior. So we're going to see how this eventually is going to lead to more of a Latin takeover of the ancient Roman Empire. So even though the Etruscans were some of the earliest people to settle in this area, we tend to associate the greatness of the Roman Empire to the Latin peoples themselves. And then again, I don't want to get into detail about the Greeks, but we know that there were Greeks that were living in southern Italy. This was left over from the colony period of ancient Greece. We know that as the population of Greece continued to grow, they did not really have enough room or food, so they started to branch outward geographically, and one of the places that they settled was in Italy. So, and also one other thing is that because there was a Greek presence in Italy, this is going to cause a pretty significant cultural link between ancient Rome and ancient Greece. There's similarities in terms of their religion, in terms of their literature and culture, and we'll talk about those more as we move on. So the earliest Roman government was a republic in nature. As I discussed before, when the Etruscan people were more in charge, they did correlate around a monarchy. And as time went on, this started to evolve into an oligarchy, which we remember is a rule by the few. The oligarchy, those people that were in control were always nobles. They were always highborn and wealthy. The last of the Roman monarchs was named Tarquinius Superbus. And he was eventually overthrown by patricians. We're going to talk about patricians more as time goes on, but it's basically a word for the noble people, the wealthy. And that signals the beginning of the oligarchy. But again, as time goes on, we're going to see that the oligarchy does not last for particularly long. And when the Roman Republic is established, this becomes what we now call a representative democracy. In other words, the people elected representatives. They elected rulers and legislators to debate and make laws instead of having the entire population of citizens vote on issues. So this is a little bit of a difference from the Greek democracy, which was more inclusive. And, in general, we talk about the Greek form of democracy as a direct democracy where every citizen got to vote and talk about issues. The Roman Republic got too large for this. So what we're going to see is that the earliest legislative body of the Roman Republic was called the Senate. This was made up only of patricians. So again, it was represented only by the wealthy. It is going to be pretty sufficient in size. By the 4th century BCE, they're going to be about 300 senators, and they served lifelong terms. But as you can imagine, since the senators only came from the patrician class, the people who did not make up the wealthy start to resent this. They want more representation in government. This happens many times throughout history, right? We can see this as far forward, of course. We can think about the French Revolution as based on the same class conflict. And of course, this continues into the modern day. So we'll talk about how this ultimately ends up changing. So again, I already sort of described who the patricians were. They were the ones who declared Rome a republic in the first place. And again, I just wanted to point out that we could definitely compare and contrast the Roman Republic with the Greek democracy. In general, again, we think of the Greek democracy as one that was a direct democracy, and we think of the Roman Republic as one that was a representative democracy. So be sure that you're familiar with that difference. But the majority of the population of the Roman Republic, they were called plebeians. Plebeian is a word for basically the common people. They were not as wealthy. They have a variety of occupations. So we have small farmers, tradespeople, crafts workers, and soldiers. And as time goes on, they're going to start to call for more political reforms. They resent the fact that the patricians are basically the only people who have a say in government, And as time goes on, we are going to see that these changes occur. So for example, one of the things that happens is that in 287 BC, the plebeians end up winning the right to be full citizens. So this is a dramatic change. They then start to develop their own political bodies. They gain their own assemblies. There were two of them. One was called the Assembly of Tribes. One was called the Assembly of Centuries. And these were also legislative bodies. The plebeians then could elect people to the assemblies. They were called magistrates. Okay, so it's basically a word for a representative, just like we call people senators and House representatives. Magistrate was the word for these people that served in these assemblies. And these people could carry out the day-to-day operations of the government. We're also going to see that along with the Senate, these assemblies are also going to act as courts. We're going to talk about the tribunes in just a moment. But another thing that I neglected to talk about, which was up here on this bullet point, is that plebeians also, when they become citizens, they get some improvements just in their general social status, so they can't go to prison for their debts anymore. And there even were some instances where plebeians and patricians could get married. Although that wasn't particularly common, it was interesting because we see that the plebeians are going to rise a little bit in their social status. Again, let's move back to be in order. The tribunes were the word for the Roman courts. They were elected, or the representatives of the tribunes were elected by the plebeians, and the purpose of this was to try to ease social tension. So the tribunes actually had veto power over the Senate, which meant that if the Senate made some law and then the tribunes ruled that that law was unfit, unfair, they could actually strike it down. And what we're going to see, though, is that despite this extension of power for the plebeians, the wealthier senators are going to try to have influence over the tribunes so that the plebeians don't have too many rights. And so some of the more practical senators would get these plebeians to sort of take their side. They sometimes would promise them things like protection on a military basis. They would promise them rations of bread and wine. And so by having these friendships with the plebeians, or plebes in short, the senators sometimes could still undermine the power of the tribunes. So Rome's government in general was divided into two different branches. We have the legislative and executive branch. So the tribunes were sort of seen as part of the legislative branch. That's why we're not talking about a judicial branch like we have in the United States. So the legislative branch, just like what we have in the United States, was a law-making branch. What they did was they were the ones who chose the executive leaders. So unlike what we do in the US, where we directly elect our president, the legislative branch actually chose what were called the consuls, which we're going to talk about in the future slide, but the consuls were the executive power. So they were like the presidents, more or less. So the Senate also, like the legislative does, they proposed laws, they debated about laws, they debated about foreign policy, they just made decisions about building infrastructure in various cities of the Roman Republic. And they also had the power of the purse, as we say, which means that they basically controlled the republic's finances. They could tell consuls how much money they could spend, and also they could recommend what they could spend it on. So in general, we think of the legislative branch as actually the most powerful section of government in ancient Rome. And then the executive branch was made up by consuls. There were always two of them, and the consuls served one-year terms, and they always came from the patrician class. So they were basically the two most important magistrates. So they were elected by the Roman citizens, and their job was to preside over the government, and they served as the commanders of the army when the Roman Republic was at war. One consul had veto power over the other, which was an important example of what we call checks and balances. This is why I have this little balance graphic. In a lot of ways, there's an important legacy of checks and balances. We use this very frequently in the United States government. The idea was that if one consul made a decision that was seen as corrupt or not a good idea, the other consul could actually veto it. But as you can imagine, since there were two consuls, that could mean that if the two of them were constantly at odds with one another, it actually could make it very difficult to make decisions. And when there was a time of crisis or emergency, the Romans did have the ability to appoint a dictator, and the dictator would replace the consuls. Basically, the dictator was a single ruler, right? His word was the law, so he also had power over the Senate. But again, this only happened during times of emergency. So the dictators could overrule the consuls. Now, this is a good example of the fact that we have a legislative branch and an executive branch. This is what we call divided government, right? So this is a really good example, again, of checks and balances, which are one of the major things that shape our government today. Roman laws are also important, again, for the long legacy that they carry and also for the way in which various citizens were treated. So the 12 tables were the first set of Roman laws. They were seen as a concession toward the plebeians, because before the 12 tables were written, laws could be very unjust or unequal, right? So you could treat people differently based on their social status. So the 12 tables were brought about because of the inequities that were apparent when the system of laws was not written down. There was unrest and strikes throughout the plebeian class. So when these laws were put in writing, they were in full view of the public. So this provided a really important check on the injustices that previously existed in the judiciary system. And we could also think about how important this is in terms of continuity and change. This is a concept that is built into numerous later constitutions. The fact that so many governments throughout the world have a written constitution today, and some of them, like our Constitution, have a Bill of Rights that are included, make it very clear what protections the people have against the government, right? Which definitely appease people regardless of their social status. These 12 tables dealt with basically every aspect of life. They dealt with business transactions, property boundaries, and penalties for crime. So in that sense, we could compare it to Hammurabi's Code. Again, they're both really significant because they were written down. But one of the differences one could argue is that Hammurabi's Code made key distinctions between social classes, right? If you were of a lower social class, you tended to receive a harsher punishment under Hammurabi's Code. This was not the case with the 12 tables. People were treated more equally under the 12 tables. The other thing that's important about the development of Roman law is that it provides a lot of opportunities for people who study the law, or essentially new lawyers. One of the most famous of these lawyers was Cicero. We see him here on the right. He was trained in writing and oratory, which is speech making, by Greek teachers as well as Roman ones. So it's important for us to realize that Roman law gained some of its values from ancient Greece. His writings about the law are still studied today, partly because they were very clear, they were very precise, and they were very persuasive. So as we continue to talk about the Roman legacies, we're going to see that Cicero's ideas are still read today. People who study the law, even in the United States, now many times gain important legal knowledge and important legal base from people like Cicero. And the fact that these courts existed, the fact that we have legal terms that were written down by people like Cicero, and also entire orations that were given in the course of lawsuits, show us how significant the rule of law in the Republic was. So the Romans wanted to make sure that their law was consistent, that it was fair, and again, this is something that really shapes our present-day legal system, so nothing to underestimate here. So we're going to stop and start part 2, which is going to talk about the expansion of Rome as well as general characteristics of Roman society.